are very happy to have Maria Repnikova with us, and happy that she has been welcomed here by our co-sponsor, the Department of Communications, so thanks to them also for making this possible. Maria earned her PhD at Oxford in politics in 2014, and since then has held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Project for Advanced Research in Global Communication, while also being a resident scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China, both of these units at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's housed last year and this year. In the past, at various times, she has also been a visiting fellow or scholar at Georgetown University, at Cambridge, and at the Carnegie Moscow Center. And during all these stays has managed to produce an impressive array of articles, as well as a book manuscript now under review on the question of critical journalists in the state, which is what she will speak to us about tonight. So without any further delay, let's welcome her.
Thank you. I'll just open up. Okay. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yeah? So thank you so much for the welcome and for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure to be here. And today, as Robin mentioned, I'll speak about my book project and the key arguments and findings that come out of that, titled Critical Journalists and the State in China, the Case of Guarded Improvisation. So the book project builds on my dissertation at Oxford and postdoctoral work at Penn, and I guess there'll be revisions to follow, but I'll just present to you what has come out of it so far. So to start with, the popular imagery of Chinese media tends to be that of a loyal agent of a party state, the state that really gives very little leeway for any criticism, indoctrinated to do primarily propaganda work, silenced by censorship, and threatened by coercion. Chinese journalists function in a very difficult place, one of the most difficult regimes when it comes to press freedom. As you see here, China is marked in black along with other states like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan when it comes to very serious and grave situation concerning media freedom. When we do hear of voices that tend to challenge the system in some ways, the images of dissidents tend to be invoked in popular press. Here you see Ai Weiwei, a famous Chinese artist, whose art really kind of borderlines protest movements. He really critiques the state as a whole, challenges its legitimacy, and we hear a lot about his actions and the way he's being repressed in China from popular media accounts of this artist. At the same time, beneath this imagery of collision between isolated critics and the omnipowerful party state, there are webs of negotiations that take place between various journalists and Chinese officials that often go unnoticed in popular media depictions. Particularly, I argue that in the past several decades, a practice of what I call critical journalism has emerged in China, which encompasses investigative, in-depth, and editorial coverage of contentious societal issues. The group of journalists who embark on this practice is a very diverse bunch. On the left here, you see Wang Keqin, who's a veteran Chinese investigative reporter, never studied journalism, but has headed investigative bureaus at various Chinese newspapers in Beijing, and delved into issues as diverse as coal mining disasters and improper vaccinations in Shanxi. On the right here, you see Chai Jing. She's a TV journalist and producer who studied journalism as her major and has delved into more systemic issues concerning food safety and most recently pollution. Her film Under the Dome has attracted millions of viewers recently in China, basically investigating and probing into how pollution is being dealt with by the Chinese government. So these are just some very brief manifestations of this very diverse group of people that emerged essentially out of this vast shift that happened in Chinese media system in the past several decades. And this shift encompasses various elements, including commercialization of the media, which means the state letting go of some of its subsidies and allowing journalists to be more free and to exist in a more free market kind of economy when it comes to media. Advertising sector has boomed, more diverse media content has emerged. We also see more advocacy reporting, journalists actually interested in activating certain kind of policy change in their reports as opposed to merely reporting on certain issues objectively. We see transformation in journalism education, opening up to the market ideas as well as that of the West, rise in social media, and a globalization of communication. All of that presenting diverse platforms for some of these critical journalists to function at. Primarily, they function at commercialized news outlets, including Caixin magazines, various parts of Southern Media Group, primarily Southern Weekly, but also some of them work for state media. They're investigative outlets within state media that's completely owned by the state, such as Xinhuan program as CCTV, Bingdian, China Youth Daily, and others that I'm happy to talk about more further on. There's also a group of freelance reporters who do commentaries for various types of media, and most recently a fusion of online and offline investigations that take place on this platform called Tencent. So there are various different types of platforms that provide a place, a space for these critical journalists to work, to exist, and to try to challenge some governance issues in the system. So the overarching questions I'm interested in addressing and talking about today is why does the state that's so obsessed about maintaining political stability and very much intolerant and suspicious of liberal media still tolerate and allow for some of the spaces for critical reporting to take place? And why do journalists that essentially face quite high risks in partaking in this game and very low probability of actually changing something, why would they embark on this endeavor? And most importantly, how do the two actors manage their delicate relationship, and what explains its continuing perseverance, particularly in the past decade? That's the period that I'm interested in leading up to today. So with those questions in mind, I think it's important to think about critical journalists as not solely journalists or media professionals, but as representing something larger and allowing us to learn more about broader theoretical debates, including the dimension of so-called politics on the boundary of the permissible, a boundary-spanning activity in China with various actors partaking in it, including NGO activists, lawyers, and others, journalists being one manifestation of that. But essentially, they're kind of more sensitive to the party state, because not only can they channel demands from bottom up to the state, but they can also end up galvanizing certain social movements, as a lot of them are popular opinion leaders on the internet. They can also frame issues in a particular way that allow for some social movements to take place. So by probing into this issue, we can learn more about mechanisms of adaptation and resilience of the Chinese party state. This account of journalists is also that of limited openings for political participation under authoritarian rule, something we know a lot about when it comes to elections, but much less so when it comes to other spaces like the media. And finally, it's another step towards de-Westernizing media studies. So far, there's a growing field that tries to look at media studies beyond the West. And in this case, I'm taking a media oversight role, or the media watchdog role, that's really linked to liberal democracies, and looking at it in a very different context of a one-party state. So the approach I take is that of looking at both the top-down and the bottom-up perspectives on this relationship, both the view and the actions of central authorities as well as local officials, and also the journalists themselves, kind of tying and fusing them together, examining their routine interactions on a daily basis, but also how the terrain that binds them shifts during major events, major crises. Particularly, I look at coal mining disasters, as well as the Wenchuan earthquake of 2008. And the data that I draw on in this talk and also in my book is primarily fieldwork data. I spent over a year in China interviewing these journalists as well as officials, over 120 in-depth interviews that have taken place through so-called snowball technique, where people introduce it to their members of their cohort, their colleagues, etc. And spending a lot of time with these people, not only just on interview basis, but partaking in various social events, conferences on media investigative reporting, on campuses, being invited for meals, and etc., participating in kind of the observation of the day-to-day interactions, as well as analyzing discourses of how the state views the role of media oversight through official journal reports, as well as the reports that our journalists publish themselves, so the investigative articles they come out with, and kind of seeing how the two come together and how their own reflections about their role are manifested in their articles. So it's a combination of different types of tools to examine this relationship. And what I propose today is that we should look at this kind of relationship between journalists and the state as that of a collaboration, essentially coexisting under a shared framework, but at the same time they keep negotiating their relationship through what I call a guarded improvisation. So journalists and the state are unified by a shared goal or agenda of gradual improvement of the party's governance in a very broad sense. But the way they negotiate this role and this agenda is very much through various acts of creative improvising that happen in an ad hoc manner and very much in response to one another. So throughout the next half an hour or so, I'm going to talk to you more about the facets of this improvisation, how it takes place, and how it binds them together in this fluid collaborative relationship. So to start with collaboration, so the party state grants journalists a so-called loose, ambiguous consultative role within the system, and journalists tend to align their objectives with that of the central state. And it's very important to distinguish here between the central state and the local state, because as you will see, the objectives of local state are often used as a way to kind of safeguard their space in the system. But they're really positioning themselves as actors that work together with the central state in identifying and in also reaching certain governance goals. So first of all, when it comes to the state, in addition to the dominant media role of propaganda and most recently called soft kind of guidance of public opinion, an alternative media function has emerged over the past several decades called Yulun Diandu, which is literally translated as public opinion supervision. It's a broad term, but it's invoked particularly in the context of the media, first noted by Zhao Ziyang in 1987, and has been repeated ever since in various party documents, as well as through my interviews with officials. So what does this media role represent? More broadly, it's a discourse about media being kind of a mechanism for local level oversight. So it's tied into the web of feedback mechanisms and local accountability, allowing the central state to oversee what's going on the ground in various localities. Considering the fragmented nature of Chinese political system, it's deemed as quite a useful mechanism to see what's going on and to correct for various issues and failures that are happening. It's also more broadly perceived as a kind of public opinion feedback mechanism, the idea of learning more about public preferences on specific issues beyond just accountability of the local state. Some articles that officials come up with explicitly say that the more efficient media oversight, the more efficient is the guidance of public opinion. So the idea is that the more you kind of learn about what public thinks, understand their demands, the better you can shape their opinions further on and in a more favorable direction towards those of the party. So the two functions of propaganda and media oversight tend to kind of go along together in this one fused role of Yulun Diandu. Media is invited to play a kind of constructive role in political processes. The idea of it being to expose issues, but also to contribute to solutions. It's not just about underlining failures, but it's also about coming up with ways to solve failures. So it's very much kind of a consultant role as opposed to simply being a journalist. You're supposed to also advise the state on what to do about things you find out, whether at the local level or about public preferences and dissatisfaction with certain issues more broadly. So what about the journalists themselves? Well, the overarching perceptions of their role in the political system is that of change makers within the system. Some of them explicitly distinguish between their role and that of dissidents. One interview in particular noted that I don't want to be a voice critiquing the system from afar. I want to be staying in China within the system and contributing to a gradual involution of the party state, as opposed to being far away and isolated and unable to do anything about it. So this change maker within the system is manifested particularly in these two ways of focusing on improvements versus solely revealing facts, but also a focus on local level failures, echoing very much the agenda of the central state that I just introduced to you earlier. So in terms of improvements, a number of journalists noted that they think carefully when they publish something about what consequences could this bring about after publication. Is this going to lead to societal chaos? Is it going to bring about protests, problems? Or is it going to lead to more kind of gradual solution to something? So this improvement rhetoric was particularly explicitly told to me by one editor who set up a number of these magazines in China. What she noted was that in the West, the media oversight role is particularly associated with just revealing facts and failures. But in China, she noted, because the system is still in the process of transformation and remaking of itself, what we need is more balanced and constructive reporting, which not only allows us to safeguard space within the system, but also allows us to contribute to meaningful societal change. That was the end of her direct quote provided in the interview. More specifically, I found that by looking at investigative reports on coal mining disasters and on the earthquake, is that this idea of improvement is very much manifested in their reporting. So for example, on coal mining disasters, beyond exposing the disasters and what went wrong, a number of journalists, particularly Caiding magazine based out of Beijing, suggested that the state should commercialize the mining sector. So they really advocated for a completely different approach to managing the sector, as opposed to solely saying, well, things are going wrong, how about you fix this on a grand scale? That was a big, big statement made repetitively over the years by this magazine. It wasn't taken into account, but they did try. When we look at the Wenchuan earthquake as well, there was a lot of discussion of how to fix accountability on the ground so that public construction would be more safe in general, not just the schools, but other buildings if it comes to disaster. So there's a lot of effort in the reports to provide certain solutions. Some of them are direct, some of them are actually very indirect, by invoking examples of what has worked successfully. So in the earthquake, a lot of schools collapsed, over 5,000 kids died. As opposed to solely saying what went wrong, some reporters went about exploring which schools didn't collapse. Some of them were funded by Hong Kong NGOs, for instance, or Western NGOs, and they had a better oversight system in place. So the reports revealed how that was done, what took place, and maybe Chinese authorities could adapt some of those external methods and mechanisms to oversee safety. So that was indirectly implied through their reports. The other aspect of that is focusing on examples from the West, saying, talking about how the US or other countries have dealt with earthquakes or other disasters, and then in turn suggesting indirectly that China does the same. So very implicit, subtle ways of contributing to improvements. The second facet of local level failures, again, something that's echoed, from the official point of view, the idea that almost all discussion of, incidents and things that journalists cover, they focus on local level issues. Of course, local is a very broad term in China, stretching from provincial level to county and village level. So they can really vary in terms of what's considered local. But the idea is that beyond provincial level, things that concern the center are almost never addressed in these reports. They're not touched upon, especially when it comes to certain officials. The only exception is the recent anti-corruption campaign, which I would argue still fits into this framework because the state kind of invites these journalists to expose very specific individuals. It's not about the journalists going after them first. So it's a very different dynamic, but I'm happy to talk to you more about what I think about the campaign in the Q&A. But basically, this idea of local level failure is prominent throughout the reports. When we look at the mining disasters, the key blame, the key kind of framing of accountability is placed on mining managers, and the blame gets diffused the further you go up in the system. So as you get to the local officials and even higher ones, it's very unclear who is guilty and what should be done about it. Same thing with the earthquake. When we look at the schools, the key blame is on education authorities managing the school safety, and then beyond that is, again, quite unclear as to who else should be overseeing those officials. So it stops at a certain level, a local level. And the other facet of this change maker within the system mentality is a certain expectations from journalists to actually see a reaction from authorities to their reports and investigations. They expect that at least something will be done. Even if it's an immediate kind of response, even if it's just fixing a certain number of schools, some kind of an obvious reaction or acknowledgement of their reports will take place. They see themselves very much as an important accountability mechanism within China, even if it's often failing. They still have this belief that they have a place and a role to play in the system. So despite this framework of collaboration, it of course remains a very tense relationship because what should be improved at what time, by who, is a question that's constantly being renegotiated. Which issues are sensitive when and how? Again, it's another question that's constantly slipping in and out of the framework. So what happens is that there's a lot of improvisation, a sort of dance that takes place between officials and journalists in order to sustain and renegotiate the boundaries of this collaboration. So to start with officials, if you look at these different three levels of how they endorse media supervision, how they control it through censorship, and how they respond to media investigation, at each one of those levels we see a significant amount of fluid, kind of ambiguous activity on behalf of the state that yields improvised action. If we start with endorsement, the very policy of Yulundiandu is a very, very fluid one. The term itself is broad, and the way that the state presents it in their articles and in interviews, they don't explain any kind of explicit, boundaries for how this media role should be invoked by journalists. They should just do their job. They should just be constructive. How should they do it? Do they have any protections while they're doing their job? Should they collaborate with officials in so-and-so ways? None of that is kind of clearly spelled out. It's a very broad discourse. And most importantly, it's not codified in law. So basically, there's no law of the press or there's no law protecting journalists in embarking on this practice. This means that if they get in trouble, there's nobody out there to really help them. So the discourse remains the only official policy and endorsement of media oversight, which allows officials to backtrack. For instance, they might never mention this policy for a year and get back to you in 2 years and say, yeah, we still support media supervision. So whenever they feel like it's the right time, they will invoke this term, but then they might retract once again. There's no legal kind of supplement to this, and many media scholars in China have pushed for that, but no success so far. When it comes to censorship, the topic that a lot of you might be familiar with and hear a lot about the Great Firewall and various facets of restrictions placed on journalists, again, we see a significant amount of ambiguity. From journalists who I've spoken to, who experience censorship on a daily basis, they noted that about 50% of their stories never make it into print. Oftentimes, they'll be out in the field interviewing officials, gathering data, and in return, just get a phone call from their editor saying, come back, the story's cut. This is the most frustrating aspect of their job because they invest a lot of resources, a lot of their connections and work into making the story happen, but oftentimes that just never makes it out in print. And the kind of fluidity on restrictions within the gray zone of so-called contentious issues, but not the ones completely off the limits. So when we think about Tibet and separatist movements and challenging the legitimacy of the party, those are never to be touched, right? But then there's a whole gray zone of issues that are semi-sensitive, like corruption, environmental degradation, crisis, disasters, things that kind of question state legitimacy, but not immediately attacking, the very essence of the party state. So when it comes to those issues, censorship tends to be really evolving on an almost hourly basis. And the forces behind it that I found that are very important is, first of all, how popular are these issues in public sphere? If the public is widely discussing them on the social media, for instance, censors might call into journalists and say, look, don't touch it now. Let's wait until we actually come up with a response. And then we're going to call you up and you'll report on what we did about it. You're not going to go out and investigate this issue. So until social media kind of reactions calm down, the media is not invited anymore to participate in this whole investigation. Local officials play a huge role also in limiting journalist investigations because they have high stakes in this game. They might lose their jobs, they might not get a promotion. They're very adamant at stopping journalists from carrying out their investigations. This can happen through networks with propaganda authorities at the central state as well as at the local level. This can also happen through slipping envelopes under journalists' doors in hotels and then red envelopes that contain money, the next morning arresting them on corruption charges. This happened several times from my conversations with journalists. This can happen through physical assaults, actually beating up journalists or taking them into a certain isolated space and physically basically blocking them, stopping them from investigating issues. In this case, local officials take their own kind of improvised tactics in their own hands and just try to stop journalists at any cost. So this fluidity in restrictions, it goes in terms of it's apparent in all restrictions, from pre-publication censorship to access of information to post-publication harassment and coercion. All those things are characterized by significant amount of ambiguity that journalists have to play around with. And finally, when it comes to responding to media investigations, so once investigations come out, there's also kind of an ad hoc element to that, which I call a kind of combination of immediate reaction and a very ambiguous systemic response. So when we think about the earthquake, for instance, as soon as investigations came out about the schools collapsing, the government came out with rebuilding the schools that most suffered in the earthquake and making it a very big appearance that they basically publicized through the media, museum exhibits, everything, to say we did react, we did fix the schools. Schools are fine. But then when it comes to anything beyond those schools, nobody got punished. And this issue was completely closed off to public discussion. Media was prohibited from further investigating it up until this day. So the reaction is very kind of twofold and not exactly that transparent, and it's very hard to question it once the state decided what they're doing about it. So various forms of improvising renegotiation of what media supervision actually means in China on the official level. When we look at journalists, they try to take advantage of this ambiguous space and of course do what they can with it and push the boundaries as far as possible. When we think about the discourse, the idea of this policy being so fluid and vague and not legalized in any form, journalists often use it as a kind of discourse strategy to get access to certain events or spaces where they can discuss more sensitive issues. So to give you an example, on this banner here, you see an advertisement for an annual media oversight, media investigation conference, Yulundian Duhui. It was usually an annual event that brings together over 200 journalists, editors, and educators from across China to talk about media oversight. What failed, what worked, why, what can we do better? So this is just an advert at Hangzhou at a local university, and it shows that this event has been sanctioned by authorities. Everybody's welcome. It's publicly open, please come. Then once the actual proceedings took place in the after hours, right inside, right on campus, there were a bunch of people covered around a small table talking about the role of the media in the collapse of the Soviet Union. A very different topic, talking about democratizing role of the media and how it can lead to systemic change, something that's not really allowed to talk about in academic circles or in political circles in China. So they took advantage of the space that's legal and that's sanctioned and to try to kind of push things a little bit. And actually, the speakers themselves and the organizer of the conference told me that they often use it as a discourse strategy. So it's actually their own terms, the way that they invoke that. Some journalists also renegotiate the idea of media supervision in private. They would say, hey, I tell everybody I do media supervision in official terms, but in reality, I see myself as a Western-style, objective kind of reporter. That's all I want to do. But that's something they talk about amongst friends. But publicly, they would kind of put on this imagery that they do exactly the kind of media oversight role that the state wants them to do. So in some ways, it kind of echoes what happened in the Soviet system, the late Soviet Union. Some of you may have heard of Yurchak and his work on hegemony of form, this idea that people can comply with certain forms on the surface, but in reality, they keep renegotiating the ideology in private and also in public. So this is one example of how that happens in China. When it comes to pressures, political pressures and censorship, there are a myriad of tactics that journalists deploy in basically preserving their space and pushing forward to report on more issues. When it comes to, for instance, pre-publication censorship, just to give you examples, there are a certain kind of mix of tactics that they use, including microblogging, extraterritorial supervision, so reporting on issues outside of their home province or their home city, and also trying to wait out censorship when possible. So how does this work? So for instance, when officials are watching for contentious issues online all the time to try to censor journalists. Journalists are also watching on what becomes kind of a hot issue on social media, trying to see what's popular, what's exciting, and in a sense, outrun censors as fast as possible and try to get the report out before they get blocked. If they succeed in that, that's great. That's the optimal outcome. But sometimes they don't. And oftentimes what they do is that they investigate something outside of their home province or jurisdiction where they can actually stay away from local pressures. Oftentimes it's a collaborative work whereby journalists will collaborate with other journalists on the ground, and oftentimes through social media they meet them and communicate and engage in shared projects investigating issues that they can kind of get away with. Sometimes it's a famous outlet like coming from Guangzhou, Southern Weekly, famous reputable outlet, would work with somebody very local on the ground, just dig information out and then publish it in Guangzhou. Sometimes it's two famous outlets working together. It depends. But the idea is that it's very important to kind of play around those loopholes of local state and go to a different province or a different kind of jurisdiction and just investigate things there. There's plenty of similar issues taking place everywhere in China. If you don't manage to do any of that, and or you have collected all your data and you're still censored, you might be able to wait out censorship. And what does that mean? Well, in China, of course, the censorship bans don't have an expiration date, right? But they do become less and less effective over time. And because a lot of the issues they talk about are systemic, they keep repeating themselves, like mining accidents, pollution, protests against certain factories, etc. All of them are kind of like repetitive issues. So what some magazines do is that they wait out for a certain time and they just write about all of them together. So when it comes to mining, what they did was that they had investigative topic of the year in 2005, 2006, when they just talked about all these accidents that took place over the past decades all together. And then so look, there are all these trends, there are all these characteristics that are the same over time. So let's just plunge into this. Let's look at the system. Let's go deeper. So in many ways, this kind of piece can be more effective, actually. But initially, when you look at it, you think, well, it's already expired. It's old news. Who wants that? But again, in the Chinese context, you have to kind of think in more long-term perspective and think, well, these are the same things that keep repeating themselves. So we could actually wait out censorship order and do it later. So this is another kind of effective, I would say, strategy that journalists embark on. When it comes to policy response, as I mentioned, it's very hard to negotiate that. The state leaves very little room for questioning their response to media investigations. Nonetheless, even in this case, there are various attempts by journalists to keep pushing further. So for instance, with the Wenchuan earthquake, after the schools were rebuilt, some journalists managed to sneak into the area and investigate the schools from the inside. What they found is that not only were they overspending on those schools, a lot of money allocated to like 3 schools, but also that the safety measures were not necessarily that effective. They found that a lot of those schools are actually not that safe. And parents were not happy at all with how things turned out. So they kept digging and they published those reports, some of them in Hong Kong to avoid mainland censorship or elsewhere. But nonetheless, there's always like pushback. Even when it's a very small space, there's always a pushback. But when it comes to pushing back on policy response, journalists have to really pick their battles, right? Because if you keep pushing on one issue, they might not get to investigate another issue. So they're very careful about like which battles to pick. So when it came to coal mining disasters, the state did not end up commercializing the mining sector. They ended up actually taking even more control and ownership of the mining sector and consolidating it further, becoming both the proprietor of the industry and the oversight, the guardian of it. A very complex relationship, they argue, that makes the mines more safe. So they didn't go with the responses provided by journalists, but then journalists said, well, look, we can keep pushing, and they might get silenced completely. We want to investigate anything else, or we might just let this go for now and push on, pollution or another issue that's equally important. So they really pick their battles strategically, and that really depends on gatekeepers, the top editors at those publications that make those decisions and enforce them upon journalists. And sometimes the editors are very connected to authorities, and that way they can kind of sense the red light. When is it time to stop pushing and time to engage in something else? So tricky dance, again, improvising with what's tolerable, what's not, at what time. At the same time, when we think about this improvisation, we have to remember that it's a highly guarded process, and the state remains the kind of band leader, the leader of this process, by which it defines the scope and the pace of interactive improvisation. It's by no means an equal relationship. Starting with the kind of this framework of media supervision, the state explicitly says it's a party-led mechanism. Media oversight is not an independent oversight as we might envision in the West, ideally, but it is very much kind of a mechanism that's supposed to sustain the party rule, help it improve itself, ideally to respond to certain concerns from the public, but it's not supposed to be an independent channel altogether. That's not talked about anywhere. So the scope is already very limited to that agenda, set out by the state. And when it comes to the pace of improvising, they can also put a red light, of course, at any time and say, look, that's enough. We build the schools, don't go any further. This topic is still sensitive. We look at Tianjin disasters recently, the big blast some of you may have heard about in Tianjin. Same thing, there was space open for a while, a lot of investigations came out, and at some point, the state just said, no, that's it. No more is going to be talked about. Not about the firemen who died, not about all the issues that were overlooked. Enough. So they kind of put that red light. Again, the state guides there, but when it comes to journalists, they also, of course, embark on a great degree of self-censorship, what I call tactical strategies with which they operate within the structures, set out by the state, as opposed to, challenging the overarching structure altogether. And I'll demonstrate that to you here. In this slide, some of you might know about this protest by Southern Weekly in 2013, a big and widely covered protest by the newspaper against censorship at the local level. They challenged the censor in Guangzhou about remaking their New Year editorial and basically kind of really shrinking their space for editorial freedom. It was kind of an unheard of event in China. A lot of journalists came out, a lot of the public supporters were outside the building of this newspaper, and it was framed in Western media as really kind of an act against censorship. At that time, I wrote an editorial about it, arguing that Chinese journalists are not yet revolutionaries. They're not kind of acting against the system at large. They have a very localized claim, which is a claim against this particular censor. When they appealed to central state, they appealed again as kind of consultants and agents for change working with the center, and that they need that space that they used to have to continue to be constructive, to continue to play an important role in that system. When these people came out to support them, in fact, a lot of journalists stayed indoors, didn't come out to talk to the public, and they reached a silent deal behind the closed doors with the censors to resume their work. So this was a very particular event, but I think it kind of really showcases the dynamics between journalists and the state. Even in this case, where they really push as far as possible, they actually protest against the censor, which is very rare. They still maintain this kind of idea of working within the overarching system and collaborating with the central state. In the end, their freedom actually really decreased, so they didn't gain much from that kind of agreement with the local state. And for now, their effectiveness and their kind of role in public debate in China has really well. So it's a bit of a sad story in the end. But just wanted to manifest to you how, the tactical strategies are used, but how the journalists are still very much reluctant to challenge the overall system of censorship in China. So what do we learn about these ideas about journalists and the state when it comes to the Chinese political system? I think we see that very much the relationship between journalists and official reasserts the kind of fragmented nature of Chinese political system. The idea that journalists and the central state keep taking advantage of these various loopholes within the system to their advantage. So the central state wants journalists to be a kind of an oversight channel to look over what's going on the ground at the local level. And journalists are pleased to play that function and kind of play central and local interests against one another. Sometimes, in fact, journalists also reach deals with local officials in which they're kind of happy to collaborate with them for so long as they get something out of the center as well. So there's all kinds of interesting webs of dynamics in which this fragmented system is being played to the advantage of central state as well as local officials. I think this relationship also really kind of showcases the fusion of so-called consultative governance in China, but also very fluid and adaptive mode of policymaking within the system. So this idea that the public input is invited by the state, it's invited more broadly, not just for media, but with judiciary system, petitions, etc. There are various channels like that that have been kind of invoked as consultative authoritarianism, this idea of China having a more enlightened form of governance, essentially, than other authoritarian states. But at the same time, the way that they invoke those consultations is very much on their terms. It's very fluid and oftentimes very ambiguous, and the rules are not so clear, when to consult on what. And they really prioritize flexibility in both the process of consulting with the public, but also in how they respond to the public demands. So it's an interesting combination of features, which in the long term could be quite challenging to sustain, because if you don't have a long-term systemic response to some of these issues, they keep reoccurring. Same thing with disasters and all these various effects that we see with pollution. If you don't address the long-term roots, it's very hard to sustain this kind of consultation in a productive manner beyond the kind of imagery that it works. So it's a tricky balance. I think it's very important to watch for the friction between those two. When it comes to China's societal activism, as I mentioned at the beginning, journalists are just one facet of kind of boundary-spanning activity or politics at the boundary that take place in China, amongst other actors like NGO and civil society, people who engage in all sorts of acts of change. We see with journalists that once again, this activism is very much embedded within the system, something that others have argued as well. At the same time, the modes with which the state interacts with this activist is very fluid and also very unequal. So first of all, we see ambiguity here as both a constraining and a facilitating force. So lack of clear rules allows those journalists also to push as far as possible in redefining their space, but it also, of course, contains them within a certain system with which they can't really challenge central state at large. So it's both a constraining and a kind of empowering force, to be looked at carefully, I think. Also, state-society relations, I think, in China, often called kind of symbiotic or codependent and so forth, they're not that symbiotic. If we think about that, it's very much an unequal collaboration. The state always defines the rules so far consequently and consistently, redefining the boundaries to their advantage. So we really have to think about this unequal force, unequal factor, and the journalists are always just a junior partner in this relationship. So, thinking in broader terms about comparative authoritarianism and how this story of critical journalists fits in, it shows that state-sanctioned openings for political participation can serve different roles under authoritarian rule. In this case, the ideal role, the kind of role that's projected in the system, is that of a feedback an accountability mechanism. We don't really see that that often in other authoritarian systems. For instance, if we look at Russia, another case that I engage with a little bit in my book as well, and in my other research I engage quite a lot. In Russia, journalists are not granted that space for consultation or so-called accountability channel that they play within the system. Their relationship with the state remains very contentious, where they challenge the state as a whole, and the state really disregards them and treats them as marginal critics. It's a very different dynamic in the Russian state, in Russian society. And there's this notion of kind of feedback and constructive governance is not really present there when it comes to critical journalists. So perhaps China in some ways is somewhat unique, or maybe those facets are present in other systems. It's something to explore further. But it also shows that the relations between critical actors and the state under authoritarian rule can take different forms. They can extend beyond state domination and overt contention that we often see in the literature, but they can also invoke this kind of constructive partnership, which in some ways, even if very ambiguously, may contribute to some consequential kind of incremental policy change. So there are different types of relationships, I think, to watch out for, to be aware of, and Chinese case presents one model, perhaps, to examine further. And finally, to conclude with this idea of non-Western media systems, when we think about communication in non-Western societies, the comparisons that are being made so far really focus on systemic level. What kind of media system is it? If we look only at media systems, we kind of overlook the process that takes place beyond that systemic level and the small openings for contention that might exist even within an authoritarian state like China. So I think what I'm calling attention to here is really the importance of grasping the process of interaction between these journalists and the state, and to kind of feed that into our analysis and in a comparative framework in non-Western context. So looking at how these relationships actually work and are renegotiated as opposed to solely thinking about the systemic meta level of analysis of non-Western communication. Investigative journalism also is a category, as we see in the China case, that escapes political kind of dimensions. We often think of it as just a liberal idea, as something that should exist in democracies, but actually we find that some facets of it exist also in authoritarian systems, granted on a much more limited scale, but still a very vibrant and interesting field to examine and to think about. The pressures that journalists face in China, in some ways, actually echo pressures faced by journalists in the West. For instance, the need to form relationships with officials, the difficulties to access information, and most recently, a lot of fear of censorship as well in the United States as well as in China. Again, the degrees are starkly different, but it's important to think of it as kind of a gray zone of pressures and an overarching kind of gray zone of this investigative reporting, how it evolves on a global scale, and how China is just one manifestation, perhaps something we could compare to Western systems, not only to authoritarian states. And finally, I think journalists are important to look at as a kind of a part of larger milieu of social activists. They're not just journalists, they also partake in social movements. They can frame them, invoke them. They can guide civil society members on how to enact certain changes on the ground. And it's really apparent with social media, where a lot of them are popular figures online. So I think it's important to see them as much more than just journalists, and perhaps envision them as kind of more of social change makers in some of the societies where they play that role. So I'll stop there, and I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Questions, please don't be shy. Yeah. Thank you for an interesting talk. I'm a critical journalist in China for more than 15 years, and before I started my PhD here. I highly appreciate I think your conclusion that Chinese journalists are not about revolutionary, and they also have the improvisation, or what other scholars call the boundary innovation. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, there's one point you raised just now, as both journalists and the government official want to improve the CCP's governance.
Right.
I personally don't think this is the case for me and my colleagues.
Yeah. So you're saying that although they collaborate because they have to, there's certain goals that they have that are distinct from government improvement.
Yeah. Right? I don't think the final goal is to improve the government.
Yeah, I think it's the overarching idea that there is no other option. So when you're working with certain social issues, there isn't really an option of completely distracting the whole system as it stands and then doing something totally different. It's kind of like the space that's provided is that of acting within this larger system. So I think that they don't always believe into it completely or buy into it internally. As I said, they renegotiate that kind of notion of media supervision, especially amongst their friends and colleagues. There's a lot of criticism about where they stand, especially in the past few years. There's a lot of cynicism about what's moving, what's changing, and what's really their objective here. But at the same time, I think they're very pragmatic actors. So they work with what they have, basically. So that was what I was referring to. It's not that necessarily that they really, in their heart, believe that that's the only way to go, but that they see this as a pragmatic kind of compromise, that that's what we can do at this time, especially after Tiananmen, when they saw that being organized against the system at large and striking at it like that didn't work. So compromise became kind of an after effect of that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But also like what you noted, this kind of incidents, the idea of them pushing on some issues that have nothing to do with improvement, I completely agree on some of these issues, but they tend to be kind of personal, individual issues, right? When it comes to social issues, larger social issues, I think there's more of that framework that I spoke about here. But I'm happy to talk more afterwards. Thank you.
So, great talk.
Thank you.
And there's something that I think you raised in the talk that I haven't seen in your written work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, so I have an interpretation of some of the things that you've discussed, and I'd like you to comment on it if you don't mind. It's not really
sure.
a question, it's
Mm-hmm.
more. So I was thinking about how this collaboration, this relationship between journalists and the state,
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to think about it in terms of other state-society relations,
Mm-hmm.
so with lawyers, activist lawyers,
Mm-hmm.
or with NGOs, or with, and there really seemed to be something distinct
Mm-hmm.
in what you're looking at. I know that you based your work in Beijing,
Mm-hmm.
but it seems that conceptually, the story that you tell seems that these journalists are very much kind of collaborating with the central authorities.
Mm-hmm.
Not with the local authorities,
Mm-hmm.
and that could be a very, very different relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question is, framing it in this way, it really seems that journalists are almost kind of, in terms of a state-society relationship, they seem to be somewhat elitist in that they're working kind of with the center and not with the, and so we're going to have dinner, so I have lots of other questions. That maybe draw from this, but is that a fair interpretation to come away with?
Well, the journalists I was looking at and the magazines and outlets I was exploring are kind of national level, fairly elitist outlets. So they see themselves as nationally reputable. They're not like local level, news outlets. And I think that makes also a difference in terms of what we think about this relationship. There are other critical journalists on the ground in various localities that do fascinating work, but I was interested in more on a national scale. So I picked those that have reputation cross-national, and they do oftentimes come out as, elitist perhaps as a negative depiction in some ways, but they do see themselves as kind of above the average, much, much above the average in terms of their skills and their capacity to do something about social change. So their relationship with central state, as much as it's maybe internally conflicted, they still do see themselves as kind of important, potentially important agents within the state-society framework. When it comes to local officials, for the most part, the story is quite negative. The idea of tension, local officials not providing information, hiding away, and actually some journalists saying we don't even want to interview them because as soon as you show up there and they find out you're on the ground, you might face so much harassment, the story will never come out. So social media kind of kicks in here. You might be able to find some information online and not even have to interview this official. So there is a kind of tense situation on the local level, but at the same time, that's not always uniformly the case. There's also elements of collaboration with local officials when strategic objectives meet. So for instance, a local official wants to send a certain signal to the center and to share a certain story to get more resources or to say, look, like I'm doing my good work here, I'm going to present you the story and you frame it and you channel it. In this case, journalists actually share that they are okay with a degree of self-censorship and okay with letting go of some of the story in order to maintain local level relationship. So here they're kind of like, okay, maybe this is a long-term relationship we can maintain, and I can do more stories with you. They're openly, admitting that. So in some cases, in rare cases, collaboration can also work at the local state level. But for the most part, this relationship of collaboration refers to the central state.
Could I just ask
Yeah.
one more? And so not in the case of local officials, that point's well taken, but with local journalists.
Oh, local
would it be
journalists.
fair to say that they are also looking for their story, that ultimately their target is for a national story, not for a local one?
Yeah, their target is more of a national story. That's why sometimes they can kind of probe what local journalists are working on, and they might not have access to the same kind of outlets to make it into a national story, and therefore they would share information, or they're just, stopped or blocked by censorship, they can actually just share with another outlet. Sometimes also the sharing happens through just members of society, like for example, a lot of petitioners who can't access anything in the system, they're frustrated with all other channels, they come to journalists, not to say that it often works, but they think that it might work. So the guy who I showed you earlier, Wang Ketin, who was on the, I think the left side of the picture, he does a lot of this kind of work. So when I was waiting for him, for instance, at his office, he had other people waiting along with me, all of them flying from as far away as like Sichuan and other places to share their stories. They had folders of files of how they've been mistreated by various companies, state-owned corporations, enterprises, all kinds of issues. They had deep down grievances. They were hoping he might take this folder, unpack it, and present it in a consistent manner as a story. And then when I entered his office, he had like shelves of those folders. And he said most of them he can't do. There's nothing he can do about it. It's either not a story or he's just not able to because of censorship. But yet there's this belief, from various actors, including just members of society, who think, well, maybe this guy is so famous, he might do something about it. So I think there is that kind of dynamic for sure.
Do they describe themselves that way? Do they see themselves like that?
It's a bit tricky because they kind of have diverse descriptions. Also, just to mention that a lot of them are based in Guangzhou, not necessarily only in Beijing. So there's a bit of regional variation as well from people I spoke to. But a lot of the offices are in Beijing, so I was mostly based there for research. But I think there is this facet of kind of, what is it called, patriotic worrying. I think there was work on that historically about these intellectuals who keep worrying about the system and having this place within the system to keep kind of making it stronger historically. I think there is that sort of element, but they don't invoke that directly themselves. I don't think they kind of are aware, they don't reflect that deeply to think, oh, why am I this way, And I think for somebody like Wang Keitin with his petitions, he's actually quite frustrated by the level of negligence on behalf of various authorities that leads these people to travel. He was a little bit annoyed. It's almost like, my God, I want to go home, and like it's 7 p.m. and here's another guy who shows up here, and like there's nothing I can do for him. Like within 2 minutes, those guys were snapped out of his office, and they flew 3 hours to get to him. So it's not like he's sitting there thinking, wow, I'm really like doing this work and it's doing great. He kind of feels like there's nothing else he can do. It's like this is what's left for him. Like this is his piecemeal of the pie, but it doesn't mean that he's happy with it, so to speak. So I think they kind of don't go as deep to reflect on why they're in that place, but it's again kind of a pragmatic situation where like either I do this or I do nothing. Like where do I find myself? Like this particular guy actually opened a civil society kind of movement, NGO, that helps cancer victims from mining disasters, because he saw his reporting is not doing it enough. He's like, I'll do this now and I'll help them out, in certain ways to gather money. So there's kind of different ways of being this societal agent or actor, and I think it's rooted in different layers, including historical kind of understanding of intellectuals in the system. So, yeah.
That is their exploration. According to my observation, I want to know how would you think about that?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Very good comments. The first comment on Neitan, or like the internal reporting, I did interview a number of people as well at Tsinghua Shi and Remin Rebao. It wasn't as prominent of the part of my study because I'm really more interested in open public investigations, but I found that some of their perceptions were actually quite similar in terms of the way they position themselves and the kind of work they do. Sometimes they saw themselves as somewhat superior to regular journalists because they got more access to things. It doesn't get screened in the same way. It goes straight to official channels. So sometimes I think there's kind of a sense of them coming from a very famous state-run outlet, getting certain access at various places they travel to, kind of privileged position in a sense. But then, of course, their censorship within that system, even when it comes to Neitan, it's quite severe. Like a lot of editorial guidance on what should be channeled back to the state. So it's not clear like how much of it is a clear-cut copy from what they see. Some of it gets really like remade as it channels up the whole system. So I think that it's more complicated than them having just more openness or whatever. I think it's actually quite controlled relationship as well. When it comes to your point about local versus central, it's a very good point, and I agree with you that a lot of these local issues do end up invoking central level kind of failures, the same thing that I found in my analysis of these cases. But at the same time, the focus tends to be still on a certain local incident that can tell us something about the system at large. So this is, for instance, very different than if you look at Russian investigative reporters who will attack the system straight on. They will say, look, Putin is like a murderer, he's corrupt, he has like a palace he built for billions of dollars, the system is completely unjust, everything has failed. Like that's kind of, they attack it straight on. Like if there's a case that they look at, it will never be in a province. Nobody cares about provinces in Russia. They will only look at Moscow. You look at Moscow and you investigate what's going on there. Sometimes there's like a little environmental thing going on close to Moscow. They're like, okay, fine, I'll travel there, like with some friends, have some fun, whatever. But like that's not their key, passion at all. In the Chinese case, you say, yeah, they don't stay in those localities, but they do, go there to do interviews. They're very aware of like regional dynamics, and there's a lot of interest in like taking a certain case and saying, hey, what can we learn about the system at large? I don't think that necessarily negates this idea of local central friction. I think they're still taking advantage of the loopholes and saying, hey, we can take a local incident and kind of frame it as something bigger in a way. But then it's up to the audiences and the state to figure that out. It's not that clear sometimes. You read about this incident, you're like, well, is he saying something more? Or is it just stopping there? And from my analysis of the discourses of these reports, the higher it goes up in the system, the more kind of ambiguous the language can become about who is guilty. So if we're looking at specific officials, who is actually guilty, oftentimes that part gets really fuzzy. But yes, the incident might tell us a lot more about the system failing at large. So I think it's a very implicit and a very interesting dynamic, but it still kind of goes together with the same idea, I think, of central-local manipulation of those relationships. So I hope that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah?
Sorry, how does the relationship journalists have with the state officials influence how the general population views the credibility of these journalists in what they're reporting?
Mm.
And how does that really work out just in terms of actually affecting change with the local population?
Okay, so good question. I don't think that people are always aware of exactly, those dynamics that are going on. Like they had certain reputation that these newspapers may hold. Not all of them do to this day, but for the past 10 years, for instance, they can be considered to be kind of more brave in that sense. That was respected. I think it is still respected by general public. At the same time, with the rise of the internet and social media, there's a diversity of information, and many people, embark in their own battles on whether it's China's version of Twitter, Weibo, or like the new platform Weixin, or other platforms with which they engage in. And in that way, they kind of can decide what's truth for them and what's really like the right way to approach a certain issue. So I think there's more diversity, but it also leads to more confusion. It's like, who is really credible, right? So I don't think there's like a deep down sense of, oh, they're collaborating, therefore that's wrong, because a lot of public actually supports the central state too. If you look at the survey research, a lot of them support central government, they're very critical of local government. So in a sense, it feeds into that picture too. It's like, okay, here we go. Again, somebody's guilty here. Maybe the system is failing, but yet perhaps somebody up there is doing something about it. So yeah, I think there's kind of complicity in that sense as well.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk, and I really enjoy your concept of critical journalists.
Mm-hmm.
It's an important corrective to what are more conventional portrayals of Chinese media as being tools of the state.
Mm.
My question for you is whether you would characterize these critical journalists as being a majority group. And if we think about the dance
Yeah.
between the critical journalists or journalists more generally and the state, are there simply a larger group of people perhaps that are apathetic and prefer not to dance at all?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely, I was not trying to kind of give you the false impression that things are really so exciting. They are exciting in this very particular small, space that's what you call boundary spanning activity. It happens right on the boundaries of what's allowed. But overarching kind of, this whole overarching society of journalists and the overall work of journalists in China is not at all this kind of work. So most of them still remain to be not propagandists, but they work as a way of kind of guiding public opinion, reporting on certain issues, but without that dance mode. But at the same time, I have to say that everybody dances. There isn't like, it's not that black and white, right? Like I analyze a lot of propaganda work as well, and kind of reports that tend to be published just by official media, have nothing to do with critique, but I still find very creative ways to convey certain issues through editorials and other ways to kind of question things here and there. So it's not all like opposites, just critical and non-critical. There's also a lot of things that happens in the middle. And I think especially with social media, there's more room for that to happen as well, despite the censorship that takes place there. So yeah, they're definitely exceptional, but yet there's a lot of kind of in between that we should be careful not to dismiss too quickly. But thank you.
I really admire you.
Yeah.
Your drive and your courage to do this amazing research. But I wonder how your background, how that would influence the whole thing.
That's a great question. Yeah. So let me see. I guess I can kind of illustrate that through comparing how I did my research in China and Russia, because there's a very, like you mentioned, very different contexts for carrying out research. So in Russia, I'm ethnically Russian. So when I go there, I'm taken as a local, basically, or somebody who's studying abroad or doing whatever, but I'm kind of treated as one of them in many ways. So you would think that makes it easier, but at the same time, it puts a lot of challenges and pressures on one as a researcher. So when I go there, there's a lot of pressure of not getting anything wrong. When you get into an interview, they interview you first. They're like, sit down, tell me who you are, what are your questions, why are you asking this? And there's a lot of pressure to kind of appear as credible in their eyes. And then once you pass their filter, they might introduce you to people. But even those introductions and those interviews start with them asking you questions. And they're really difficult questions. And if you start asking them something, they don't like the question. They're like, what are you asking me? This is like a philosophical question one can write a book about. And they really dismiss it. So there's a lot of kind of tension and animosity. And I think pressure of why did you leave? You're Russian. Why are you not here? Who are you? You're doing research on us? What's going on? So in some ways, I found that being local there in Russia, in some ways more challenging, even though it did open a lot of doors as well. That perhaps I couldn't open in China. But in Chinese case, yes, it is sensitive and it is a very challenging topic to study and being, looking different and everything else. But it's kind of took a lot of visits and a lot of work to develop the relationships there. It just took many years, essentially, because I started with a thesis at a master's level in Chinese education system, journalism education system, and starting with educators who introduced me to their students, and then to introduce them to their colleagues, and then journalists who were invited to give talks at education institutions. That kind of the first web of connections. That was like the beginning. And then I go back and those journalists, very few of them, introduce me to their colleagues. And then it goes on and on and on. And then essentially the credibility builds in a sense that, this is somebody we know. She's been back here many times. She's not publishing a Western media article, that's gonna put us in trouble. Names are not, incorporated. It's all anonymous, essentially. I try to make it as, easy and as safe for them as possible. And the conversations are really about their perspectives and engaging on multiple bases. So you come back one year, you come back the next year, you meet them again. So it's not like you meet them once and you shut the door. You really maintain the connections. Also with their families, it kind of becomes this almost like semi-friendship in some ways, but it's just very much like a deeper engagement. And I think that's the only way to learn more about this issue. Otherwise, you end up staying at a very surface kind of level. You don't get anywhere from that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess it was challenging, but it also was surprisingly amazing how people were opening their doors and how helpful they were. So I think, it's just for me to be grateful for all the effort on the Chinese side in the research. And you said something about Russian influence on Chinese perception. Yeah.
To me, it would be interesting
to compare. Yeah.
The similar ideology to start with.
Right.
And then also state control. I think it would be really interesting comparison because some of the issues you talk about China, I wonder, is that special about China or does something like another country has similar thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I am doing comparative work exactly on the topics you mentioned, and I found that it's actually very distinct. The relationships are very distinct. As I mentioned towards the end, in Russia, it's much more contentious. And I just told you before that Russian journalists would attack anybody up there they can, the critical journalists, I mean. They investigate whatever is possible, but they're really considered to be kind of like outlaws of the system. A lot of experts refer to them as kind of islands of press freedom. And the idea of an island as a metaphor is really significant because they're cut off from the system as a whole. It's like, here they are over there. You can talk about whatever you want, but you're not going to get access to any officials. You're not going to get funding. You're just kind of a voice that's almost like a dissident-like voice amongst other intellectuals who happen to achieve almost nothing in the Russian system, as we saw with protests and everything else. Nothing changes, on the grand scheme. But they do see themselves as hopeful for changing the system at large, because they're very disappointed with how things turned out. As you mentioned, there was hope for democracy. They were very influential in glasnost periods in late 1980s. 1990s, they were still influential, and in 2000, it went downhill. Like, the public doesn't trust them, the government doesn't care about them. So they see themselves as like unfairly marginalized and kind of voiceless. So the relationship is quite distinct, and I think it's interesting that you say Chinese journalists are aware of that, negative trajectory, and they might see themselves as more likely to compromise as a result of that. So.
I wonder whether do you think the recent market trend can impact some kind of your conclusions such as the innovative improvisation, something like that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I actually wrote a piece about Namfang Media Group and the decline of Namfang Zhomo as a result of market pressures, more so than even political pressures. They lost so much of their share. And it does impact them. They have done fewer investigations in recent years. That said, there's still kind of pioneers that are still going strong. Like Caixin magazine has done amazing work on various crises and investigations in recent years, and they're still financially very vibrant. They're exceptional ones, But there's also more and more of that happening online. Like Tencent has this in-depth reporting unit, which is fairly new because, on social media, usually you couldn't investigate things there and publish that. You could just discuss certain issues. But now there's like an in-depth unit which carries out different kinds of reporting. So I think there is, again, kind of an adjustment to the situation. Like maybe the market pressures are high, but then they move online and try to do something there. There's more and more kind of evolution of this media sphere. So I don't know if that means the space is shrinking necessarily, but I think there's definitely a transformation in like the platforms and who writes where and how. But the actual ways in which they engage with authorities are quite similar still. So yeah, I think your insights were kind of spot on. Like there's different explanations we could take into consideration in thinking about the differences. One of them is the nature of the political system as being much more fragmented, I would say, in the case of China than in Russia. In Russia, you have this kind of power vertical where the central state, essentially Putin and his colleagues, they tend to control very much what happens in various regional bases and appoint a lot of these politicians themselves. There's this kind of line of authority which spreads in this vertical manner. And there's much less, if you notice in terms of the economic development, much less experimentation, improvisation with different kind of policies. It's much more centralized, everything. So once a certain highly ranking official shows up at this province and says, hey, build this mine and like fix it in a month or something, Then they're hustling and bustling and everything is sort of happening. And then none of it is almost ever completed. If you look at the Far East bordering, China, it's extremely underdeveloped. And so much resources have been put into that place. I've studied that in the past, and it's just, frustrating to watch how such a potentially rich region in many ways, land, resources, not many people, but they could collaborate more with China perhaps. They haven't done that much at all. A lot of it just goes straight into corruption and nothing in terms of oversight. So there is that fragmented distinction. In China there's a lot more improvisation, experimentation with governance on many levels, and therefore it creates a lot of frictions as well, a lot more need for different actors to perhaps oversee some of these experiments and see what works and what doesn't, kind of incorporate it into that whole system. I think there's also political culture and a kind of historical dimension to it as well. In Russia, as I mentioned in the 90s, they had an experience with democracy. So having had that experience, it's very hard for journalists to accept that they might have a different role to play now. Like they don't see themselves as possibly kind of collaborators of the central state. Like they don't see the state as legitimate, the whole thing is very different. They haven't had an experience with this kind of system of democracy in China. The movement again for democracy failed, so in a sense it led to even more compromised position I think that journalists have to take just to be pragmatically kind of existing in that space. So there is that element of history that I think is very important because a lot of Russian journalists refer back to their experience in the past and say, well, that was great old days, like I was so famous and everything was happening and I was at the front line of political movement and here I am, like nobody cares. So there is that notion as well. So I think there's kind of several layers of what could explain it. And the other one about legitimacy, it's a broader, I guess, theoretical question, but in Russia, there's a lot less state concern with legitimizing itself with the wider public as a whole, beyond public opinion polls and saying that Putin is popular. There's much less concern of let's do something about governance because it matters for our legitimacy. Governance results, in China there's so much polling of public opinion surveys and all kinds of ways to see what's concerning the public, how can we fix it? There's a lot of sense of if we don't fix it, things might fail, the system might fall apart. It's very little of that discussion in Russia, a lot more, I would say, actually manipulation of public opinion by the state, very sophisticated propaganda, and a lot of acquiescence on behalf of the public. So very different. I think legitimacy is seen as a kind of popularistic regime where Putin is the one who makes it legitimate. He's a figure that's very loved and admired by many people despite all the faults that are exposed by the media all the time. So they don't see it as necessary to react and respond and to fix things as much in order to legitimize themselves. So it's a long answer, but I hope it provides some insights into your question.
So the Chinese state produces tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of graduating journalism majors every year. And I suppose most people in the room have some sense of what American journalism students go through. In other words, that there's a sort of an indoctrination and a socialization to a particular identity as an independent voice and the importance of journalism in a democracy. I'm wondering if you have any sense of what sort of identity Chinese journalist students have. In other words, do they have any sense other than that they will be working in negotiation with the state?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Or if you've ever looked at this.
I have actually. I'm finishing a piece now that looks exactly like this. So it's a great question.
I'm glad
But
I asked it.
yeah, it's the way I see it is that there's a very split identity amongst journalism students about what they can do, what they should do, upon their graduations. On the one hand, they're very aware that yes, there is this role, like you said, negotiating role or whatever, and there's also this alternative media function that seems to exist. They might be able to carry out some oversight over certain issues, but there's also this real pragmatic understanding that this is a really tough job. That it's great that there are people like this journalist I showed to you that do this, and they often come to speak to them in their classes. Actually, they speak and lecture them, and students come out very inspired at first. They're like, wow, this is amazing. They're actually in tears. They're like, this is so cool. Like, they want to follow this guy around. They're very emotionally moved. But then they kind of step back. They're like, well, can I really do this? So the first level is hey, it doesn't pay much, right? It's not a really high-paying job. It's a lot of risks. It's tiring. A lot of them talked about just being tired. It's I can only do it when I'm young, for a couple of years, and then I'm going to do something else. There's a lot of this kind of reluctance on many levels of can I really engage in that role? So it's this is a great idea, but I'm probably not going to be doing that. So majority of students I spoke to actually pick commercial venues for their jobs as they graduate, which I think is very common in the West as well. Public relations, marketing, all kinds of other ways in which they can use their communication skills and get paid for it. So it's not that common actually for them to embark on a serious journalism career, not to mention investigative reporting or something that challenging. So it's kind of a split identity in a sense, aspiration for it, but yet reluctance to engage in it. So.
Ask one more, Andy. This could be our-
I guess my question is, this kind of sense of moonlighting journalists, moonlighting as NGO activists, NGO activists moonlighting as journalists. Did you find that, or was that kind of maybe something that was true in a particular
period? Yeah, I did find that. I also found that there's a lot of collaboration amongst different groups of activists, including journalists, own specific agenda. Like in your work, you talk about policy entrepreneurs, right? This idea of enterprising with this whole system. I think it also applies to journalists, and the way they enterprise with it is also through collaborating with other types of actors. So some of the workshops I sat on in Beijing, for instance, there were workshops that included environmental activists, lawyers, Western NGO people, and journalists. So the idea was like, how do we push this issue further on the agenda? So journalists were like one, puzzle, in one kind of aspect in this puzzle, but then everybody else had to work together so to figure out how to do it right. So everyone was participating. I think that was really interesting to see how these groups were all interactive, and they were not necessarily friends, but colleagues. They were kind of working in the same circles. They follow each other on social media. They're like much more than journalists in that sense. They're like, well, we actually care about pollution. The lady I showed you earlier, Chao Jing, she had this film, and in the film, it was very much like her notion of like both an activist, I think, and a journalist, and attracting wide public attention and relying on experts and others who she interviewed to shed light on this issue. So I think there's a lot of like back and forth, and I don't know if they necessarily say, oh, I'm an activist or I'm kind of moonlighting as such, but implicitly they are, essentially. Like a lot of them are. But then there's another group that are strictly just journalists, and they would say, no, I don't want any of that. All I want is objective professional reporting in a Western style. Kind of, I don't want to be both an activist. This is not even the right thing to do. So there is that split as well, amongst students and amongst professionals. But I think there's also a lot of this back and forth kind of movement between different groups.
Good evening. Then join me in another warm thank you.
Thank you.